All right, let's dive into one of the most chaotic, earth-shattering periods in all of European history, the Age of Reformation. We're talking about a time when faith, power, and the very fabric of society were thrown into a crucible. And believe me, what came out the other side would define the modern world. And at the absolute center of this whole story is one single, powerful question. How on earth did one German monk, armed with nothing but a list of arguments, manage to completely fracture the thousand-year-old spiritual and political unity of Christendom? That question is going to be our guide as we watch an old world collapse and a new one get violently born. So, to get our bearings, let's look at the timeline. Our story really kicks off around 1450, not with a battle or a king, but with an invention, the printing press, which just completely changed the game for how information moved. Then in 1517, the fuse is lit. That's when Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses. And it all culminates in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, a treaty that finally ended decades of horrific war and basically redrew the map of Europe. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll see how the Protestant break just shattered that medieval unity. Then, we're going to watch as pure religious passion twists into brutal statecraft and all-out war. We'll also cover the Catholic Church's massive counterpunch, and then we'll dig into the deep social and cultural anxieties that just gripped the entire continent. And finally, we'll pull it all together to see how modern Europe was born from the chaos. Right, let's start with the first crack in the foundation. Before all this, Europe saw itself as one big, unified community of faith. They called it Christendom. But by the 1500s, that foundation was already showing some serious cracks. You see, the Catholic Church was facing a huge crisis of credibility. I mean, think about it. You had the Avignon papacy, where popes were basically living under the thumb of the French king, and then the Great Schism, where you had rival popes excommunicating each other. That stuff seriously damaged the pope's authority. And on top of that, the corruption was just out of control. Simony, the buying and selling of church jobs, was everywhere, and most famously, it really seemed like salvation itself was for sale through these things called indulgences, which were supposed to reduce your time in purgatory. And a lot of that money was going to fund lavish projects like rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And this table right here, this is where the revolution really happens. It boils everything down to three explosive disagreements. Martin Luther comes along and challenges the church on its most basic teachings. The church taught you needed faith and good works to be saved. Luther drops a bombshell. Faith alone, sola fide. The church said its authority came from the Bible and its own traditions. Luther says, nope, Bible alone, sola scriptura. And then he just dismantles the whole power structure by proposing a priesthood of all believers, basically saying you don't need a priest to have a direct line to God. This was radical stuff. So you might be asking, why did Luther succeed when other reformers, like Jan Hus a century earlier, had failed and been burned at the stake? Well, the answer is technology. The printing press was the absolute game changer. Luther's 95 Theses, which he wrote in Latin for other scholars, were almost immediately translated into German, printed up, and boom, they were everywhere. For the very first time in history, a revolutionary idea could spread faster than the authorities could stamp it out. It was like trying to catch smoke. Now, this theological showdown, it didn't stay a word of words for long. Not at all. It quickly ignited a century of literal, bloody warfare that would consume the continents and completely change the nature of politics itself. And the 30 Years' War is the perfect example of this massive shift. It was the most destructive conflict of the era, and it started out as a pretty straightforward religious war, Catholics versus Protestants in Bohemia. But just watch how the motivation changes. By the time we get to the Swedish phase, you have Catholic France, led by a cardinal no less, funding the Protestant Swedes. Why? It had nothing to do with religion. They just wanted to weaken their political rivals, the Catholic Habsburgs. By the end, religion is barely even a talking point. It's all about state power, territory, and dynastic rivalries. And this new reality gave rise to a new kind of leader, the politique. These were pragmatic rulers who realized that the strength and survival of their state mattered more than forcing everyone to follow the same religion. Think of Henry IV of France. He was a Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism just to unify his country, famously saying, "Paris is well worth a mass." He, like Cardinal Richelieu, put politics first. This was a radical, world-changing idea. So when this devastating 30 Years' War finally burned itself out, the treaty that ended it, the Peace of Westphalia, did way more than just stop the fighting. It basically created a new world order. The old dream of a unified Christendom was officially dead and buried. In its place, you get the modern state system, where individual sovereign states, not some universal church, are the main players on the world stage. Now, throughout all this, the Catholic Church was not just sitting back and taking it. No way. Faced with this existential threat, it launched its own powerful wave of renewal and counterattack, which we call the Catholic Reformation. The Church came out swinging with a really smart three-pronged strategy. First, reform from within. At the Council of Trent, they took a hard look at the corruption that started this whole mess and cleaned house, ending practices like simony. Second, they focused on education. New religious orders like the Jesuits started the best schools in Europe, training an intellectual army to defend the faith. And third, they enforced the rules, using tools like the Roman Inquisition and the Index of Prohibited Books to stamp out heresy and control the flow of information. But, and this is the critical point, while the Council of Trent cleaned up corrupt practices, it absolutely doubled down on its core doctrines. It reaffirmed that you needed good works for salvation, that church tradition was a valid source of authority, all of it. There was no compromise on theology. And that decision is what made the split with Protestantism permanent. There was no going back. So what does a century of religious division, nonstop war, and political chaos do to a society? It leaves it deeply, deeply scarred. This was an age of incredible anxiety, and that fear bubbled up in some pretty terrifying ways. Just look at this number. Somewhere around 50,000 people, most of them women, were executed for witchcraft during this period. Now, this wasn't some leftover medieval thing. The witch craze peaked right here, in this age of supposed enlightenment and reform. It was a direct symptom of a society under unbearable stress, looking for scapegoats to blame for everything from bad harvests to disease. And where did this fire burn the hottest? A staggering 75% of all witch executions took place in the Holy Roman Empire, the very epicenter of the Reformation's religious and political conflict. That is not a coincidence. The empire was a chaotic patchwork of hundreds of tiny states, which created the perfect storm for fear, paranoia, and persecution to run wild. This feeling of crisis also completely transformed art. Art wasn't just about beauty or telling a Bible story anymore. It became a powerful weapon in the war for people's hearts and minds, a form of propaganda for both the church and for powerful kings. And you can really see two distinct styles that capture the mood of the age. First, you get mannerism. Think of El Greco's work with those distorted, stretched-out figures and unsettling colors. It just screams spiritual anxiety. But then comes the Baroque. This was the art of the confident, resurgent Catholic Church and all-powerful monarchs. Artists like Bernini and Rubens created works that were dramatic, emotional, and just massive. They were designed to awe you, to overwhelm your senses, and project an image of absolute power and glory. So, after all that turmoil, what was the end result? When the smoke finally cleared, a new Europe had been forged in the fire. Let's wrap this up with the key takeaways. First, and this is the big one, the religious unity of Europe was gone for good. The old ideal of a single, unified Christendom was replaced by a continent of competing Christian faiths, and that's a reality we still live with today. Second, the center of power shifted dramatically. As the universal church weakened, the sovereign state rose to take its place. Your primary loyalty was no longer to Christendom. It was to your king, your prince, your nation. Politics had officially triumphed over religion as the organizing principle of Europe. And finally, you have to realize that the modern European political system, this whole collection of independent, competing states, it wasn't designed on a drawing board. It was born from the fire and blood of religious war. Concepts that we take for granted now, like state sovereignty and the balance of power, they were forged in this crisis. Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with. The Age of Reformation absolutely created the political world we live in, but it also leaves us with this nagging question. Even though it established the power of the state, did it ever really solve that fundamental tension between deep religious belief and raw political power? I'd argue that's a conflict that continues to shape our world, right down to this very day.